What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another hurricane season forecast. Here's going to be a very exciting video as we're getting closer and closer to June 1st. But in this video, we're not going to be doing a whole hurricane forecast. We're going to be going over why specific factors can possibly lead to this hurricane season to be above average activity-wise. We're going to be looking at all the factors that I'm looking at and exactly how these factors can lead to this being more than just normal season. Now, that's exactly what I'm going to be going over throughout this video, and then I'll have my final map at the end, and as well these storms and hurricanes and major hurricanes I think we'll have at the very end of the video here. So I'll still have my forecast at the end, but I'm going to go over the factors and how those factors can lead to a specifically active season. But before we get in the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it, as well as smash that like button so I know you guys like videos like these so I can continue to post them every single year. And as well, be sure to smash that bell icon so you can get notified when I do more hurricane and tropical forecasts. But without further ado, let's get in the video. So the first factor that we all want to look out for anything, whether it's summer, winter forecast, hurricane forecast, you name it, we always want to look at whether the Nino 3.4 is a La Nina, El Nino, or neutral status that has a big role into global climate as a thing here. So it's going to be a specifically big impact to whether this hurricane season can be average, slightly above average, slightly below average, or just way below average or way above average. So it's going to give us a better idea of what we can expect throughout this year. Obviously, just because it's right now at a neutral, it's actually at a neutral right now, but it's actually decreasing at the moment here at negative 0.02. So it's still at a far neutral. I mean, it has to go all the way down here to be La Nina, but it has to go all the way up here to be a El Nino. So it's far from being anything at this moment. It's kind of right dead center in the middle of the neutral status. So what will a neutral year bring to the hurricane season? Well, a neutral typically still does bring in slightly above average hurricane seasons. It kind of just depends on whether it's a positive or a negative neutral. If it's a positive, which it was not too long ago, it doesn't necessarily mean since it's closer to an El Nino, it's going to be slightly below average. And just because it's at a negative side and it's closer to La Nina, doesn't mean it's going to be closer to a slightly above average season. And it just kind of just shows how it kind of just depends how strong this neutral is on which side here, whether it's favoring less shear, favoring more shear, favoring warmer SSTs across the tropical Atlantic, or favoring less warm SSTs across the tropical Atlantic. So that's kind of what's playing in right now. So this whole thing right now isn't a huge factor, but its long-term effects from this being a neutral will become the factors, such as the SSTs, the shear, etc. Even the moisture, all of that's going to come to a long factor as a result of this neutral. If it does get to a La Nina, possibly by maybe the end of the season, maybe September, October, November, that can very well possibly cause for a jump in activity. But as at the moment, we're still going to be seeing a slightly above average season because of this only being a neutral. But if it were to be a strong La Nina like it was in March, we're talking a pretty active season, not like 2020, but just under 2020. But we're kind of talking about maybe a 2017 type season at this point. We're talking slightly above average and possibly an MDR year, but not way above average, but not too far off from the average. That makes sense. But let's go ahead and look at the Arctic oscillation here for the next few months. So here's a look now at the European extended weekly Arctic oscillation forecast. So you're probably wondering why I'm looking at an Arctic oscillation when typically we look at Arctic oscillations for winter and winter storms and all that. Well, obviously, a positive Arctic oscillation tends to bring in a La Nina type pattern. However, a negative Arctic oscillation tends to bring in a El Nino type pattern. So if it's a positive AO, we're talking this being a slightly above average season. But if it's a negative Arctic oscillation below that black line, we're talking an El Nino type season. Or an El Nino type pattern. Not just because it's at a positive 1 or positive 2, it does not mean it's La Nina. It just means it's going to bring in La Nina type characteristics, but as a neutral. Same thing For the negative portion, if it's a -1 or -2, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be El Nino for that specific time period. It just means we're going to have El Nino type characteristics. Obviously, it takes weeks and weeks to transition from a certain characteristic, whether it's La Nina to El Nino or El Nino to neutral. It takes weeks. It does not happen within 1 week. But if it's like a -6, then we're talking for like a -6 for a long time period. Then we're talking possibly an actual El Nino. But let's go ahead and look at the Arctic oscillation from now 25th of May to July 9th. So this whole thing is the barrier here between a positive and a negative Arctic oscillation. And as you do see, within basically now to the late portion of May here after June 1st, we will be seeing a let's say a negative Arctic oscillation. So it's going to be becoming a negative Arctic oscillation. So we will start to see a slight change in the weather pattern, and that will be a reasoning why this huge heat wave in the United States will kind of die off in the southeast. It's going to kind of minimize back to average, and that's because of the Arctic oscillations minimizing that strength of the warm front. But really, as we go into early June, like as soon as we get to early June, it starts to go just above the margin here. So we're basically at the slightest above, slightest positive Arctic oscillation. I mean, it's basically almost just on the barrier here. And again, the mean, that's the mean, that's the whole mean. So this is everything averaged out. Obviously, we have a ton keeping it to maybe as strong as a -4, but as well we have a ton stretching out as possibly a +3 or +4. So it's kind of the mean. This is the whole average of everything here. And as you do see, the average does have it being a positive, slightly a positive Arctic oscillation as far as early June. That does possibly mean we can start to see transition into La Nina type characteristics. But it really won't be a massive change to what we have now. It may be like warming up slightly the SSTs, and that's it. Or we're going to be seeing minimal shear, and that's it. It's really just going to be very minimal change here, because as you do see, it's barely even a positive oscillation. It's kind of right on the dot, or right on the black line, which is the kind of the control there. But let's now go ahead and check a look at the actual characteristics, and actually looking at the shear, the moisture, and the SSTs, and see which how those factors will play into a role of this being an above average season. So here's a look now at the tropical Atlantic vertical shear forecast here. All the way, obviously, it goes from 6 months back here, or almost 6 months back to January, and then it goes up to 6 months forward into the winter here in December and all of that. So obviously, we want to look at the shear for these time periods, all the way from June to November. Obviously, that's how long the season is, but obviously you can start looking at it even as early as May. And there's a pretty significant pattern here, and this could very well be as a result of this La Nina type characteristics from this negative neutral. You see a dramatic drop in the amount of shear predicted here for the time period this year of specifically July and specifically September and October. That's going to be a pretty big concern. But really watching out for July, which is the next month, or almost the next month here. As we get into June, the shear is going to dramatically decrease here. And we're talking an average maybe 14 to 18 knots across the Atlantic. That's the average. Obviously, there's going to be some spots of over 18 knots, obviously, mainly in the North Atlantic. But this is looking at the tropical Atlantic alone. This is not the whole North Atlantic. This is just the tropical Atlantic, basically the MDR from basically just north of it's basically just a few hundred miles north of the equator, basically. Like, basically the MDR is the tropical Atlantic. And as you do see, we saw a ton of widespread shear throughout May, and even we saw a pretty big spike not too long ago. I'd say a few days ago, right here, and now we're somewhat decreasing here, and that's going to be the predicted pattern that this shear will continue to decrease here as we get outside of obviously the winter pattern. Obviously, you typically see those trade winds a lot stronger in the winter, and that's why obviously the hurricane season does die out in November. Not only because SSTs die out, but as well these shears going to dramatically increase. But this season specifically, we're looking at a very minimal amount of shear for 2 time periods, July and August, and September and October. So this could very well lead to a very widespread variable area of very little shear around the tropical Atlantic, specifically across widespread this whole season here. So that's going to very well be possibly a factor to this season being above average. as well. Let's go ahead and look at the Caribbean, and we're noticing a very similar scenario, and actually it's going to be happening at the worst time period. The Caribbean, we're going to be seeing a huge drop in amounts of shear between between August, September, and October. And obviously August and September are the big months that we see monster Caribbean storms coming in from the MDR typically, and that's obviously not something you want to see whatsoever. And obviously, if we have storms just spawning off in the Caribbean between the time period and there's very little shear, we're talking maybe less than 15 knots averaged out across the Caribbean between August, September, and October, we're looking at a possibly big area to watch out for the Caribbean. I mean, if this shear is going to be that low predicted, as you see, it's going to dramatically decrease once we get to June, July. It's going to be pretty high, up to nearly over 20, almost 20 knots there in June. But as we get to July, it's going to dramatically decrease, and at that point, it's going to get to its minimal energy or minimal shear by August, September, October. So as well, really watching out for the mid-season time period for the Caribbean, especially if the tropical Atlantic is seeing favorable conditions between July, August, September, and October. That could possibly allow for a ton of MDR activity, and if it's very favorable continuing into the Caribbean, we're looking at a very concerning year considering the amount of shear we're going to be seeing. So here's a look now at the SST forecast, and this is actually as of Sunday, May 23rd. It's always 2 days back, so we actually can't get specific details for today. It really updates every single day, but it's always the 2 days back. So as you do see, we're starting to see some pretty warm waters across specifically the tropical Atlantic right here, kind of just in the southern portion of the MDR right here. You can kind of see we are seeing specifically really warm waters there for portions of Western Africa right there. And as well, really watching out for some pretty warm temperatures for portions of the Western Caribbean. So overall, we do see some of our warmest waters off Cuba and portions of Jamaica. They're nearly 29 degrees Celsius, but we're even seeing warm temperatures up to nearly 30 degrees Celsius just outside portions of Africa. So as we get later into June, obviously, these temperatures in the SSTs will gradually start to increase here. They will start to increase, and that's going to be a pretty big concern as we go through the next slides, including the average SSTs throughout the month and the amount of moisture in the African monsoon and possibly the MGO. How these warm SSTs, very minimal amount of shear, and the extreme amount of moisture can very well lead to all these three factors kind of contributing to this being an above average season. Specifically, I'd say for much of the MDR, we're talking a pretty favorable season. Maybe this could very well be the MDR year that we were expecting the last year, which did not play out as a result of the high amount of shear and as well the high amount of Saharan dust across the North Atlantic for a long time period. So we had a lot of storms develop last year, or a lot of low pressure that had potential last year that did not develop because of the hard path that it had between all amounts of Saharan dust or shear. But if the shear is projected to be that low, and SSTs are still pretty warm across the board here, and we're not even in June yet, we're talking a pretty favorable year here. I mean, we're seeing already getting nearly 27 degrees Celsius across the Gulf Stream there, already getting up to nearly 28 degrees Celsius, maybe even 29 degrees Celsius near the Bay of Campeche. Let's go ahead and look at whether it's above average or below average. And as you do see, we're seeing a pretty widespread amount of warmer waters across portions of MDR, and that does seem to be quite a big trend here as we go further into May. As well, starting to see some pretty warm waters across portions of the Bay of Campeche, and like I did say, warm waters there across portions of the Caribbean. So we just have to see as we get maybe to a deeper neutral, a stronger negative neutral, this could very well become warmer waters. So we're watching for this big chunk area of slightly below average waters. This is in Celsius. We're basically seeing less than half a degree Celsius below average across this area. So it's basically average at this point. So we're seeing anywhere from slightly above average to nearly a degree Celsius to basically average waters across this whole area. So it's going to be a pretty big concern here as we get into June, as these waters are tending to warm up here. Let's actually go move my screen a little bit here. We go further back here. You did see into what is this? This is Thursday the 20th of May. We had a big jump here, nearly a degree Celsius below average across the MDR region. And as we go down to the current time, we're starting to see these waters are slowly warming up here as well. We're starting to see that trend there for portions of the Gulf Stream there off the portions of the Carolinas. So this is definitely something to keep a close eye on. Let's now go ahead and look at the CANSIPs here. Monthly SSTs anomaly here. So as we go throughout May, obviously we're looking at anywhere from average to slightly above to slightly below average temperatures across the MDR. Extremely warm temperatures there across the North Atlantic, and as well as you see some warm waters across the Gulf of Mexico. As we now get into June here, June 1st, we're starting to see these warming waters across the MDR, and these warm waters across the Middle Atlantic are becoming more widespread now into the Bahamas and into the northern MDR portion. As we now get into July, still we're still seeing a trend of warming waters across the MDR. As we get to July into August, now these warming waters will become quite visible across portions of the Caribbean here and Gulf of Mexico. As we get into August and September, and by September 1st, really widespread warm waters across the MDR. So that's going to definitely be quite a concern here. As we now get into October, really widespread warm waters across the whole North Atlantic, including the Gulf of Mexico, including the MDR, and the Western Caribbean. But let's now go ahead and look at what the European has to say. So here's looking now at the European seasonal forecast here. This is for June 1st. As you do see, there is slightly below average temperatures across the MDR. It's mainly average, but this is kind of what we're expecting here throughout June 1st here, according to the European. As we now go into now July 1st, we're seeing a big difference here. Now these waters are starting to warm up there across the MDR, as well as these warm waters out here across the North Atlantic are spreading towards the southwest into the Bahamas there off the coast of Florida. By August, we're starting to see these waters that are kind of quite warm into the equator are becoming more widespread now off the coast of Africa, as well off the coast of South America. And in September, this trend continues. These waters in the equator are becoming a lot more widespread. These waters are kind of pushing up to the north here as we get into the peak of the season with these very warm SSTs. And even by November 1st and October 1st, we're still seeing some really widespread warm temperatures across portions of the Gulf of Mexico and up the southeast coast of the United States. So really concerned that if we see favorable conditions here, like maybe let's go to August real quick. We're seeing some very favorable conditions and these storms kind of develop. We're seeing warm waters basically the whole path according to the Europeans. So that's going to definitely be a big concern if this can very well verify to be an MDR year, leading to possibly quite a bit of storms to a above average season. And last but not least, let's go ahead and look now at the seasonal precipitation anomaly here. And as we go through April, May, and June, we're seeing a ton of moisture across the MDR. I mean, we're talking a very significant African monsoon season, and as well as starting to see some above average precipitation there with portions off the northwest Atlantic. We did see that with Anna, I believe. As when I go through May, June, July now, we're starting to see an increased amount of precipitation there just off the west coast of Africa. So that this continue, we're looking at maybe a pretty big development of MDR storms going towards the west here. Now, obviously, if there's very little shear like expected there in the tropical Atlantic, and maybe very minimal amount of dust, because obviously the least amount of shear equals the least amount of hair shear and dust. So if we see very little dust and little shear, we're talking pretty favorable MDR. And even by June, July, and August, we're starting to see still a pretty big African monsoon season. But this moisture goes all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to the west coast of Africa. So overall, across all the way from Texas, Brownsville, Texas, to areas into west coast of Africa, we're talking still some pretty favorable conditions. August, September, October. Now we're watching for maybe portions of the Western Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. So I think by the point, once we get to September, I think the end year will start to kind of wear out, and you kind of see a ton of that precipitation, that African monsoon kind of dies out a little bit. But let's go ahead and now look at my seasonal forecast, or my whole forecast for the season. Let's go ahead and now look at the amount of names and just overall forecast for me for the season. So this forecast has not changed. Obviously, my last hurricane forecast was literally last week, so I don't think there's a big need to change it. So obviously, I do think we will be seeing an active MDR throughout this year, specifically June, July, August is my main area, but I really think July is very interesting in my opinion, and other people have also said this and agree with me that this July does seem very interesting for the MDR based on what we're looking at with the amount of shear forecasted, the amount of moisture forecasted, how warm the SSTs are forecasted to be. I mean, July looks really quite active here, so we're looking at an active feeder. At least it looks like it is at the moment here. Obviously, there can be a big unexpected wave of dust in eliminating the MDR, but as of now, I do think that the MDR can be quite active and be a pretty big a factor into this being an overall active season. And to the green area, I do see out-of-sea storms. So if we do have a strong Bermuda high or something like that, these storms that do form the MDR could steer to the north here, and that can allow for out-of-sea storms like we saw quite frequently last year. And the blue color there for the northeast, for the northwest Atlantic and the northeast coast, I do see a wild card. I really think it's going to be really unknown here. I think we could see some activity there, but very minimal. Obviously, we already did see one thing there, and that was Anna or Anna kind of right between the wild card and the out-to-sea storms. But I think it's gonna be really unknown here. I mean, anything can happen. We can see maybe some storms, maybe kind of go like that. Or we can see some random storms pop up and just form right here. It just really depends. So I do think it's going to be quite a nail-biter for those who live in the northeast coast. I don't think you guys are going to be seeing any big threats. But I do think maybe there's a chance for 1 or 2 landfalls, whether it's for Nova Scotia or for the Mid-Atlantic. In the widespread red area, I do think it's going to be overall quite active. So like I just said, if we do see an active feeder for NDR, the West Atlantic is going to be just filled with storms. I mean, specifically just to the parallel to that active feeder, we do have the hot spot. That's going to go all the way from the northwest, from the northeast Gulf of Mexico throughout the Caribbean into portions of the Lesser Antilles. So I think this can very well be a big factor. Like I did say, this year can very well, in my opinion, if I want to compare it to any year, like based on my opinion, what I'm predicting this year, I think if I were to compare this to any year, I think it would be 2017. Although the SSTs are very completely different. I mean, 2017 started with a very strong El Nino, but I think once we compare it to actually June 2017, June 2020, it'll become more similar. But when I'm talking about like tracks and I think just tracks wise, I think it's gonna be closely related to 2017. I mean, I do see some long track storms. I'm not saying we're being a Category 5 for Puerto Rico again, but I do think it's going to be more of a threat this year for the Caribbean than it was last year. And, of course, last but not least, in the yellowish color, I think we'll be seeing minimal activity and just not that much that many storms. And here is my forecast here. This has not changed as well. I do think we can see anywhere from 16 to 24 storms. We already have 1, so that makes it 15 to 23 more. Hurricanes 9 to 12 and 3 to 6 major hurricanes. But hope you guys enjoyed the video and see you guys later.